Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today what we're doing is talking about this rumored, theorized, reported The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time remake that supposedly will be coming out later this year. There's been a lot of conversation about how this game is going to look. The original Ocarina of Time on the Nintendo 64, there's just something about the original and how it looks. It's incredible. They pulled off some amazing things back in 1998 when this game came out, but hardware has gotten substantially better over the years. You even look at what they did with Ocarina of Time 3D, and that looked pretty cool for the Nintendo 3DS, but how will they handle things for the Nintendo Switch 2? What direction are they going to go in here? You look at what Nintendo has done with Star Fox for Nintendo Switch 2. This is a remake of Star Fox 64, and they've certainly taken some liberties here. Like, you could say, in a lot of ways, that this new Star Fox looks how you remembered Star Fox 64 back when it came out in 1997. And perhaps that's what they're going to go for this time around, but also, if you take a closer look at Star Fox, especially with the cutscenes and all, I wouldn't say it's as we remembered. There are some significant changes here. They're going for a realistic look, and the literal anatomy of the characters have changed. And so I wonder if what Nintendo has done with Star Fox gives us a little bit of an understanding of how they might treat this Ocarina of Time remake. Because they have so much power now, they may feel more comfortable with going for an art style that leans a little bit more in the direction of realism. And I think perhaps a decent amount of you watching might give me some pushback on that idea, because over the generations, we've seen with Zelda that Nintendo has not been going for realism. You look at Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild, that was one art style, the Wild era style for the Switch era, essentially, and that's all cel-shaded. And then you look at Skyward Sword, the prior Zelda, that was also cel-shaded. Now they were going for more of like a painterly look in Skyward Sword, and in Breath and Tears, well, they took a lot of inspiration from Princess Mononoke. But going back to before Skyward Sword, they had Twilight Princess. And Twilight Princess was a really interesting one, because Twilight Princess was inspired by Lord of the Rings. And Twilight Princess did aim for a more realistic look compared to prior Zeldas, and a lot of this had to do with doing a bit of the opposite in comparison to what they did with the Wind Waker in the same generation of the GameCube era. A lot of fans were turned off initially by the style of the Wind Waker, which was cel-shaded, the first fully cel-shaded Zelda game. But also, they were aiming for a very Toon-like look. Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom weren't aiming for this Toon-like look. And for many Zelda fans, that's just not how they envisioned Zelda, especially following up Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time for the Nintendo 64. But you know, there's a debate to be had here. Because back in the N64 era, because of the limitations of the hardware, they may have had a certain art style in mind, but how it appears in the game, well, we might interpret that differently. When I look back to Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, yes, there was a lot of bright, cheerful, colorful moments with whimsy, which a lot of people would use those adjectives to characterize the Zelda series overall. But there's also a lot of darkness there, a lot of implied gruesomeness. And perhaps that darkness, in some sense, we interpret because that's just what they were able to pull off with the hardware at the time. But I look at all the conceptual art for Ocarina of Time, and there's some beautiful stuff here. The art isn't going for photorealism, but it's also nothing like the Wind Waker or Skyward Sword. It's certainly bright and colorful, but I do still also sense that intertwined darkness. I mean, you look at Goma. I don't see Goma as cutesy in any way. So I think it would actually be very cool if Nintendo took a look at that original art for Ocarina of Time and tried to match that with the hardware of the Nintendo Switch 2. How that would look will appear dramatically different from what we've seen of Ocarina of Time 3D and even the original on Nintendo 64. But let's consider the different depictions we've seen for the Hero of Time. There was that Space World demo, which a lot of people envisioned as basically just what Ocarina of Time could look like with GameCube hardware. There's how Link looks in Soul Calibur 2, and then there's that cool CGI cutscene Nintendo put for the promotion of Ocarina of Time 3D. These are all nice, but I envision that the actual remake for Switch 2 will far surpass all of this. And so I start to think about other games out there where perhaps we can get an idea of how this might look. I consider maybe Oblivion Remastered. I've used that a few times in some of these Zelda discussions, because I do think it perhaps could give us a little bit of an approximation of how the environments could appear. Or if Nintendo goes for a more gritty, realistic look, what we've seen from Demon's Souls, for example, that could potentially work. Now, I don't think they're going to go that dark and gritty with this, but I'm just putting out some different ideas here. But let's now take a look at some different fan recreations of different parts of Zelda, most of which are specifically for Ocarina of Time if it were to be remade. All of these different channels, their videos will be linked in the description below. I strongly recommend you check them all out. A lot of them explain their artistic process here, but I do think there are some very good ideas to be considered. Now, with this one, this is a depiction of Hyrule Castle in Unreal Engine 5. This isn't necessarily for Ocarina of Time. I think this is more so considering the design of Breath of the Wild. This is coming from Adam Zine Learn Arc Viz. But what I really like about this depiction is that it's showing a detailed world with a lot of atmospheric and weather effects. On the Switch 2, I envisioned that these sorts of effects would be in place for this remake, and so I think that's important to consider. The fog and the mists, and a more realistic day-night cycle where we see the clouds adjusting and moving around throughout the day, and how the sun's light varies and responds to all the different surfaces and materials and objects we see all throughout the world. And all these details don't necessarily have to be just for a realistic world. What if Nintendo goes all in into the Studio Ghibli-like style? I mentioned earlier how with Breath of the Wild, it was largely inspired by Princess Mononoke, a Studio Ghibli film. What if they were to do something like this? Well, Rwan Link, who has made so many different types of recreations for Legend of Zelda, did put together a series of how Ocarina of Time could look with a Studio Ghibli-like style. I don't think Nintendo's actually going to go in this direction. I think this is very, very different from the original art for Ocarina of Time. But at the same time, there have been some pretty substantial changes with Star Fox, so, maybe they would want to go in this direction. Although, I do think, especially with a live-action Zelda movie on the way, Nintendo's going to be very intentional with this Ocarina of Time remake in terms of how it looks and how it represents Zelda overall. I think a Studio Ghibli-like look, especially something more like what Rwan Look put together here, would be considered something very different from a typical Zelda, and I think what Nintendo wants to put together for the remake, they want to sort of represent the iconic image of Zelda. So I don't think they would go for something exactly like this, but I still think it's great to appreciate the level of detail here in this beautiful cel-shaded world. Like, imagine if the Wind Waker was someday remade, which, by the way, if this remake does happen, I think it does open the door for other ambitious remakes down the road, and perhaps Nintendo does go back to the Wind Waker and makes it look something like this. I think there's that potential there. But there is a little bit of a stigma with all these Unreal Engine recreations of Nintendo games. A lot of fans has seen these different Unreal Engine recreations and feel like they are lifeless, like they lack the soul that Nintendo would put into these things, and, they're just Unreal Engine creations by one or two people. Of course, they're not gonna look nearly as good or have the same level of magic to it. But I do want to point out this Unreal Engine 5 footage of Zora's Domain made by Cryzanx. And they also make a lot of videos like this, where clearly there's a great deal of work going into it, so it definitely should be appreciated. All these different people put a lot of work into this stuff, so again, check them all out. They will all be linked in the description below. But what's been done with this? While I don't think the Ocarina of Time remake is going to look anything really like this, I do think there are elements of this that should be considered, because what we do see here are a lot of more modern day visual graphical effects being applied, like water reflections and refractions and the texture detail, things of this nature I do envision in the Ocarina of Time remake, just with an art style that resembles that original art for Ocarina of Time. And so that brings me to this recreation created by Endo, where Link is fighting the Stalfos in the Forest Temple. And I think what Endo did here is just absolutely incredible. This is a cel-shaded look, but it still has that darkness to it. And so that's what I think is so special here. Like, there are some other parts that are more bright and cheery that Endo shows. Yeah, that does look very much like Ocarina of Time. But when the ray tracing is applied, a modern visual effect, and what we see here, this looks pretty special. I do think what Nintendo would do would still look different from this and would look even better, but considering what Endo was able to do on his own, it's spectacular and certainly worthy of praise, and I do think this gives us an idea of how Astolphos could look in this Ocarina of Time remake. Now, the look of Link, I envision it a bit differently. I actually feel like the best recreation of how I would envision the remake to look, at least in terms of Link and some of the environments, is what we've seen from Curio-Matic. This depiction of the Temple of Time is beautiful, and how we see Link put together here, this feels right. This feels like how Link should look in a modern remake of Ocarina of Time. It isn't exactly like the original art, however, I also think we need to consider how this might look in a 3D space. That art is 2-dimensional. This game is going to be 3-dimensional. And so what's been done here, I really do feel like is our closest approximation to how that might look. I think a combination of what we've seen from Curio-Matic and Endo here could really work. Now, Endo went for more cell shading, Curio-Matic did not. And I do just want to point out, going back to my point about how Star Fox went for a more realistic look now that the Switch 2 is dramatically more powerful than prior hardware, over the last few generations, we've seen Nintendo go more into the cel-shaded art style, and I do think that is in large part because of technical limitations. When you're going for cel shading, you don't necessarily need to go for as much detail that would take away from processing power, affording you the option to do more things like what they did with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom with the limited hardware they had. On the Switch 2, they're going to have more options, and they don't necessarily have to fall back to the cel-shaded look. Not to say that it's a bad look. I think they could still make something look spectacular with a cel-shaded look, and still fully take advantage of the Switch 2 hardware. Now, one more thing I'll show off, just to give an idea of what they can maybe go for here, are these statues of Link from Dream Studio, and I've showed these in my thumbnails before. Please check them out. You can buy these statues, they look incredible. But you take a look at young Link here pulling out the Master Sword or placing it in that big iconic moment. This is just beautifully realized, and something like this would look incredible. But here are some other Dream Studio statues. Here is adult Link, and you see these different tunics. You can see the bomb, the chest with the heart piece, the hook shot. This does feel kind of like a modern depiction of what Ocarina of Time could have been. And here's another one of Link vs. Dark Link, and it just looks spectacular. So there are certainly some options here in terms of what would make sense for the Ocarina of Time remake, and I'm very excited to see how this is actually going to look. But hopefully, if you watched through this video, you heard about these different ideas, you saw these different concepts that could perhaps help you to envision a bit more on how this Ocarina of Time remake may look. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. If you've gone this far and you found yourself enjoying the video and you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. But I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.